Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. A few years ago, I was invited to play a new board game with some friends. We needed for this particular game to set aside a long evening from early afternoon until the wee hours in order to play because it was a fairly involved game, so I was told. Early in the week before game night, I received a message from our host with an attached file and a link to a video. I opened the video to find a walkthrough of the game's concepts and rules. The video ran nearly 20 minutes. The file was the official rule book for the game, and it was 32 pages. There are two kinds of people in the world: those who, faced with that very reality, would immediately call to cancel their plans to attend game night, and me. I love to play board games and card games too. My mind tends toward the analytical, which means that for me, strategy is a beautiful thing. I love the rules of games. To me, they're art. They're the blueprints for a shared experience which will guide a group through a set of experiences over the course of play. The group will laugh together and get frustrated together. We might even argue a little bit along the way, but all in good fun. Opponents will look for every inch of maneuverability within the rules in order to accomplish their goal. The interesting thing about games to me is that if you change one little rule, everything about the game, its strategy, its gameplay, even the way that it feels to play, will all change. Rules of games are like living forms of art, and varied as they may be, all have one thing in common: a primary rule, usually the first rule in the book, the object of the game. While the object of the game is in the list of rules, it doesn't actually govern the details of gameplay. In that sense, it isn't really a rule at all. It isn't so much about how to play the game, more so what the game is. Playing the classic Monopoly is an experience in building a monopoly. Playing chess is an experience in capturing a king. Playing Battleship is an experience in sinking battleships. It may seem obvious now, but one of the surest ways for gamers to fail in the games they play is to forget what the object of the game is. You may recall a few years ago at one of our annual meetings, I told a story about learning to play that simple card game, Skip-Bo. Its rules are fairly simple. Its object is even simpler. The object is to get rid of all of the cards in your main stack. I'd played a few turns as I was learning, along with Anna, and I was getting the hang of the game. And I noticed that there were a lot of cards that I could play in my utility stacks. Those are the cards that are there to help you set up the circumstance on the table to be able to play from your main stack, which is, of course, the object of the game. I started to play one number on another and then another, and I noticed a chain forming in sequence if I played my cards just right, which I did, because I'm smart. I think I had a little devilish grin on my face, the way I do when I think I'm winning. I felt like cards were flying around the room. I was playing them so fast. Finally, I played the last card I could, feeling as though I had played the most epic turn that has ever been played in Skip-Bo. All told, I guess I played something like 40 cards. My partner in life, but bitter enemy at the game table, met my prideful look with an ashamed raised eyebrow. She played 2 cards, one from a utility pile, and then the final card from her main stack. She won, and I wasn't even close. I had gotten so wound into the rules of the game, its mechanics and how it works and what you can do within the game, that I completely forgot about the object of the game. I just hope we haven't forgotten the object of the game in the church. One of the earliest strategies or ways of playing the game for the church in the world was intentional community. Described in the book of Acts, it says, "And they had all things in common." Followers of the Jesus way lived together, shared their resources, and did all of life together in very close community. That's the way they played the game, if you will. Different than we do now, but still toward the same object. At times, the strategy of the church through the centuries required careful responses to an empire that ran contrary to many of the things the Jesus community held dear. And through the millennia, the church has, at times, borrowed from the strategy of the empire itself, formulating rigid patterns of participation and using coercive power to draw others in. In the last few decades, our strategy has been to put up buildings all across the land with the name of a denomination on the front, and to create programs to be hosted in those buildings, and worship centered in those buildings. And we did all we could to attract people in to our buildings. The success and failure of the entire enterprise was gauged on how many people were in our buildings, and by extension, how big our buildings were. Attracting people to a particular place became so much a part of who we are as a church that it even influenced the way we went about other parts of our mission. When the wider church so very slowly began to rethink centuries' worth of teaching on gender and sexuality, it became clear that we've been a part of a global culture that shames and represses people whose identities aren't inside of what the church has thought of as normative. The movement to begin to correct those wrongs got a different name. The movement itself got a different name in different parts of the wider church, but almost all of the names for that movement included the word welcoming, as in our welcoming and affirming. And what on earth is wrong with welcoming all people? Nothing at all. Please don't get me wrong. But notice how welcoming assumes a place, either physical or at least a cultural place, to which we, the church, welcome everyone in. In some of the conversations about becoming welcoming and affirming, church members throughout the land imagined declaring a statement of welcome and the church doors suddenly being flung wide open and the pews filled with LGBTQ plus persons. A more inclusive, kind, loving world was the object we were after, and the church that welcomed people in was the strategy we hoped would get us there. For clarity's sake, I believe that the welcoming and affirming movement has done a tremendous amount of good, not all of the good that yet needs doing, but has done a lot of good. My comment here isn't about the movement itself, but about what the shape that the movement took tells us about ourselves. Namely, that we have become highly identified with our strategy. It is possible that we have, at times, forgotten the object of the game we're in. He didn't know it, but the Apostle Paul was, in a way, tooling the community of Christ followers in Corinth. for a kind of strategy. Our reading today is a little bit of an aside in the middle of his letter. He's been describing in that letter for the Corinthian Jesus-following community what it looks like to do worship together and to do life together. In other words, he's describing for them a way of going about, or a strategy. And you'll recall from last week that that strategy follows the image of the body. He's envisioned a network of people who each have their own function in the world, each their own skills and geography and work to be done, but all are bound together in spirit and purpose by God in Christ. He gives a little bit of detail about some of the gifts or tools that can be used to work toward being church, like teaching or preaching or what have you. And then comes the aside that Mark read for us just a moment ago. Right there in the middle of all the talk about gifts and roles, he pauses and says, there is something even higher than all of those gifts and roles. And that thing is the dominant theme of chapter 13. It's love. In part of the chapter, he does the best he can to define love, a reality the definition of which ultimately defies words and begs simply for action. But he does another curious thing and pits the gift of love up against all those other gifts he was talking about. He says that having the gift of communicating messages known only to the angels, speaking in tongues, is a nice gift to have. But if it isn't animated with love, it's worse than useless. It's actually annoying, like pots and pans clanging together. He says that even given enough faith, surely the highest of all spiritual gifts, he says, if you have all the faith in the world but no love, the cumulative effect is nothing at all. Even if one sacrifices everything they have, and even their very life, but does it without embodied, contextual, here with you right now love, then it's all waste. Love is the thing that gives those other gifts, those other ways of being church, a reason for being. But love is also more than that. It is eternal. When the world comes to fruition, Paul tells us, when it's all said and done, creation has grown up and come to maturity, there won't be any need anymore for miracle workers. When everything is seen clearly, then prophets will be out of a job. When all is known, we won't need teachers. But one thing will remain: love. Love animates all the other gifts because love is the end. Prophecy and tongues and preaching and teaching are all means to an end, but love is the end. It's the reason to be church at all. Love isn't a game piece, isn't a rule in the game or a strategy or a way of playing the game. Love is the object of the game. Did you wonder why in the last 2 years, when the way we have been church together, the sort of strategy that we've used to embody Christ in the world completely fell apart, the church itself did not? Have you wondered how, given that we haven't been able to be here, centered in this room as much, the community has still been able to march on? That's all because this isn't the church. This is just the shape the church has taken for a while. It's just the strategy we have adopted. In the last couple of decades, when you've heard the cries, the church is dying, because attendance in the buildings has dropped a bit. It never was the church dying. It was just the strategy, the shape of the church becoming disresonant from the world around. But haven't we seen in these pandemic months that the church will go on? But haven't we seen, too, that the strategy, the shape of our community will need to be different? Call me old-fashioned, if you must, but I think that an ability to be together is still deeply important for the church, and being together requires some place. So I imagine we'll have these beautiful places for quite a while longer. But don't we know now that the place isn't the point? That togetherness has more forms than one. That our love for one another is wider than any social distance. The truth is that we are just now on the edge of formulating what the new rules of this game will be. The new ways we'll try to get at the object. And that work will take a considered and prayerful effort. But one thing we can say now, however it is that we choose to play the game, if it is patient and kind, if it is not envious or boastful, or arrogant or rude, if it does not insist on its own way, if it is not irritable or resentful, if it does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth, if it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and if it never ends, then we can't lose. Amen.